For your presence and for your words on this point. We will now hear from the political groups on behalf of the EPP, Mrs. Wisela Lima.
Thank you. Standing up, protesting, refusing with all one's heart and one's hope any form of racism. This is what I feel. And this is something that, in my views, is also our duty as members within this hemicycle. And that's why it's so important to have a common text, talking with a single voice, aloud, of what is essential, our refusal, plus our absolute condemnation of racism, our solidarity with all of those who suffer from discrimination, a strong message from the European Parliament. The violent death of George Floyd has led throughout the whole world to the need to stand up against racism and also the abuse of police forces. This multicoloured movement has led to many young people having hope for the future. I'd also like to express my admiration for all of those other police officials who do their job in an exemplary fashion and for whom being a police officer is not a job, it's a vocation. As to our history, we're not going to rewrite it. And if we can be proud of many incidents, we cannot, as human beings, we cannot not also have shame. That shame is evident when we think about the concentration camps of the Second World War and should be equally self-evident when talking about boats filled with slaves. We are proud of the values underpinning the founding of the European Union and the rules that we give ourselves today to improve the future. But we have to respond on a daily basis, give ourselves the possibility of having a policy which will provide everybody the same opportunities. And that is the only way of eradicating racism. Thank you.
Thank you, President Garcia Perez for the Socialists and Democrats.
Yes, thank you. I can't breathe. These were the words of George Floyd, which he tried to say during a very long agony. And they weren't just a shout out at that particular moment. It's the cry that spreads over a whole period, because we know, well, why is it that black people suffer more than white people from violence? And what about the health crisis and the COVID-19 crisis? Why is that suffocating blacks more than whites? The economic crisis as well. Rosa Parks ended up in jail because she refused to get up from her bus seat for a white person and go to the back of the bus. Martin Luther King paid with his life, a life which was dedicated to fight racial discrimination in the United States. Inequality and pain which are caused by discrimination have not prevented or avoided their dreams being alive today still. They want social justice, and this is what people have been crying for when they went out into the streets in their thousands and their millions, and this represents hope. And as representatives of European citizens, it is our duty to eradicate the latent racism in our peoples, in our towns and cities. It is absolutely unacceptable that since 2008 the directive on anti-discrimination is blocked in the Council. I can see Mrs. Dalli here, the Commissioner, and I very much hope that she will ally herself with us to try and unblock this, because we do need legislative instruments to fight racism, to put an end to racism in Europe, especially when you see political parties being founded which are racist political parties. People who don't know their history are condemned to repeating it. And people who are discriminated against because of their colour, their ethnic background, religion, that obviously any society built like that will fail. And we have to make sure that all societies, all citizens are free. And it's thanks to the thousands of voices of our citizens that we know that black lives do matter, and right from the European Union we have to speak out loud and clear and say, remove white knees from black necks.
Thank you, President Cholos for Renew. Ladies and gentlemen, black lives, all lives matter, George Floyd's death was terrifying, and this crime proves that in our society there is still a sore lack of respect for human life. But we must be honest. Racism isn't exclusively an American problem, it's also a European problem. What's going on in the United States in the death of George Floyd and the aggression there and the lack of respect for human life should prompt us to look more deeply into our European heart. With different roots historically, racism and discrimination exist both in the west and the east of our union. Too often, the fear of others is accompanied by deep, structured, institutional racism and socioeconomic inequalities that end up harming our societies as a whole. Unfortunately, that includes some politicians who play on that fear to kindle that feeling and use it for electoral means. A society in which one has to be afraid because one is different to other people is not one that allows for the blossoming of human life. Europe sees diversity as an asset and will never stop legislating for diversity and non-discrimination. But above all, we must cultivate it. We mustn't impose it forcefully, but cultivate it through common sense. I believe above all we must start with ourselves. And on behalf of my political group, I'd like to propose that we, the three European institutions, work together on this question. Parliament, Commission and Council must sit down around the same table and ask whether our institutions, on their inside, sufficiently reflect the diversity of our union. I would ask the Council and you, Madam President, to support the initiative for a task force on this topic, because we must contribute to building an inclusive society, starting with ourselves being more inclusive. And when we set the example ourselves, then we can ask others to respect that principle. Racism and discrimination are a shameful part of our common history and unfortunately of our present. It's our duty and our responsibility to ensure that racism and discrimination are not part of our future. Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Ceccardi for the ID Group.
Thank you, President. The death of a man following violence always deserves justice, and so quite rightly the whole world has united in mourning the death of George Floyd. But for the international press and the mainstream, some lives may be worth less than others. That's the case of David Dawn, who I'd like to recall, an African-American, 77 years old, a retired policeman. He died on the 2nd of June, online, on Facebook, trying to defend a friend's shop from violent demonstrators in St. Louis. He was black too. He was innocent. But there were no marches for him, no protests, no indignation. The protests across America have become increasingly violent and have spread to Europe as well. There has been rage against police officers and iconoclastic rage against statues and symbols of the past. Christopher Columbus, Confederate leaders, Indra Montanelli, conquistadors from the past, even the film Gone with the Wind have been called racist. Bringing down statues won't save the world from racism. Apart from racism, there's another plague spreading across the world which needs to be combated, and that is the plague of ignorance and stupidity of those who want to erase their own history.
Thank you, Mr. Kunke, the Green.
Mr. President, Commission President von der Leyen, honourable members of the European Parliament. A few days after the killing of George Floyd, I was putting my youngest daughter to bed. She chattered away and then went silent and asked me, "Will they kill me too?" Colonialism has defined American and European societies for centuries. It has created deeply rooted prejudices and inequalities that still prevail and de facto kill people. Of course, structural racism in the EU is different from the US. We don't have the same horrific history of slavery and lynching. But we do have documented atrocities in our colonial history which still resonates today through discrimination and police brutality. In addition, we have recent history of systematic persecution and mass murders of minorities, of Jews, of LGBTI persons, and of Roma people, to name a few. No one is free unless all are free. We need to send a strong signal to the US, but also to sweep in front our own door. This Parliament and your Commission will define how the EU steps up to create a sustainable society that leaves no one behind. There can be no room for racism and discrimination. A first step would be to unblock the Anti-Discrimination Directive that has been stuck in Council since 2008. Madam President, I call on you and the incoming German presidency to take this historic opportunity for action. Tonight, I want to put my daughter to bed and assure her you will be safe, because in the EU, we refuse to be silenced by hate, by fear, by ignorance. I ask on the behalf of my daughter, if not now, when?
Grazie.
Thank you. Dutch, Herman, on behalf of the ECR.
Presidente.
Thank you, President. Thank you. Well, if you listen to the way people are expressing themselves today, how good the Europeans are, how bad the rest are, and what a wonderful opportunity to have this European campaign targeting the Americans. I'd like to read something that was written, and I'm going to read out something that was written out by a European person who has allies here in the chamber and who has a member here as well. It's the beasts, the beast vipers, hyenas, in the shape of a human being who are distilling hate, which is nauseabund and disturbing, and which is spouting this out against everything that is represented by the against our language, which is Catalan. And this is written by Torra. Torra is from the party of Mr. Puigdemont, who's a member of the European Parliament. Torra is an ally of Mr. Sanchez's government in the current government, an ally of the communists, an ally of the socialists, a racist who is governing part of Spain against the Spanish. And this is what's happening in Spain. So, as you can see, we don't have to go as far as America. On the 25th of May, there was a tragic episode. As a result of a criminal act, a black person died because of a criminal act carried out by a police officer. He had quite a criminal record. He'd been in jail. He was fleeing from the police. This black person died, and this has triggered a whole wave of racism against the American system, a huge wave of hate against the police, and which has been used by others against the United States of America and against their president. And now we're hearing about fake news now.
Thank you. On behalf of the GUE, Mr. Omaji.
Non, merci.
President, thank you. For our European Parliament, it's an honour to open this plenary part session with this debate, and on behalf of my group as a whole, thank you. A tragic event has become a major political issue. The 8 minutes surrounding the death of George Floyd have led hundreds of thousands to take to the streets across the world to repulse structural racism and police violence. And our indignation this afternoon speaks eloquently of how much these actions offend against our shared values, and that's why we stand by that movement and victims of racism and violence police violence, calling for a tangible answer to be given to that request for respect and equality. Faced with that event, we must also look clearly at our history. And we must see that this event goes back to centuries of domination against the blacks in America and inequality in Europe. Let's bear in mind our European history has always acted like a pendulum between barbarism and civilization. And it's in Europe, despite reason, despite enlightenment, that the worst theories of racial hierarchy came to light to justify conquest, slavery and colonization, and to justify the Holocaust. Therefore, if we wish to expunge evil, it's a whole continent of the mind that we must take apart. And any system of economic violence must be fought because, as we observe, inequality, social inequality, goes on building on racial inequality. And in that fight we must wage, present symbols such as memory are important, and that's why we must proclaim from this very European Parliament, as our resolution calls for, that slavery is a crime against humanity, and together we must demonstrate civility.
Thank you. Ms. Ferrara, unattached.
Grazie.
Thank you, President. The brutal killing of George Floyd has led to a wave of indignation, rage and protest across the world. What happened to George Floyd, unfortunately, isn't an isolated incident. We can't be indifferent before racism and discrimination. We have to confront this phenomenon, frankly, without hypocrisy, and we have to counter all kinds of racism, the most evident, most violent, and also the less evident, insidious. And the racism that hides behind compassion or through charity or through moral superiority with a utilitarian view of those with black skins, people who offend human dignity. When fighting this phenomenon, we have many fights still to go. Cultural battles against all kinds of prejudices in social groups, to political battles to ensure that we have full rights to work, to health, to education, to justice, to political and social participation. And that's the response to any form of different forms of treatment that we expect from the institutions in the member states. Thank you.